Welcome, Jacqui.
Thank you, Becky. I'm really pleased to be here.
Jacqui and I met working in local government some 20 odd years ago, I think.
That's right.
I really remember the passion that you had and things that you were talking about to do with data then that I haven't heard anyone else talk about. But I've certainly heard them talking about it now.
I think it goes back to when I was working in administration for a organisation that managed the building infrastructure for schools in London. And they had all these different maintenance programmes, and every now and then they'd have a board meeting where they needed to look at progress and plan the next steps. Only the statistical summaries that our computer-based system delivered didn't give them enough details. Discovering the transformative power of data, of understanding data, proportions, ratios, statistics, and how it empowered you to make decisions. And I think that was my first fascination with data.
And it's not an opportunity that everybody gets these days. Yeah, I remember when there was much more opportunity to just try things out for ourselves and see where that went. That's really interesting. And where did that take you after then? Because I know that you stayed working with data, you've worked across lots of different sectors, you've had different roles.
So I went on to kind of formalise my interest by sort of going back to university. And I worked for 10 years as an analyst programmer and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then from there, I moved from being an analyst programmer, if you like, to managing corporate projects that dealt with data and the power that gave you and the benefits it can bring to people's lives.
Did you find that you were able to have conversations with people around your ideas on data and this big world that could open up and what you could do with data, or did you feel that you were kind of on your own exploring this stuff?
I think I was a hybrid. What I found is that people who worked with data, people who managed projects and programs, may not necessarily understand what you can get from data. So really it was just trying to introduce over time the power of what you could do with data, and sometimes I think people didn't actually believe it. So one of those things that I ended up doing was working with another colleague to come up with a standard that's now the local government service list, which is a standardised way of recognising the services that local government offers and shared across all the different councils so that we can measure things and we can have information exchange based on those things.
And that led you to come up with your methodology, cost to serve analytics, which has led you to write this book. Do you want to tell me what cost to serve analytics is?
So cost to serve is a measure of the total cost and effort associated with delivering a service and the permutations that make up that service. So the cost to serve concept has its roots really in the Industrial Revolution, which led to the manufacture of goods being made up of several components and several people getting involved. So if I was going to explain it, I think I'd want to break it down into two parts. So first of all, I'll explain what the cost to serve is and then the analytics part. So the cost to serve is a measure of the total cost and effort associated with making up a service. So if you think of it in terms of a production line, it's all those inputs, all the things that you do and the time you spend on it and the machinery that you use to come up with that end product. And what you've got to recognise is the cost of that to make sure that when you sell that thing on, you've actually made a profit and not a loss. The cost of these new technologies and the manpower it took to manufacture the goods had to be factored into the retail price if the company was not going to make a loss. So it's not something that's actually new, but it's something that has not been extended to service industry so much.
Okay, and I noticed that you mentioned something to me was unexpected, which was the Industrial Revolution and the answer that you gave me earlier. So I just wanted to dig a bit into that. What does that refer to?
So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, it was the beginning of mechanisation. Things were powered by water and steam engines, and there was a widespread use of electricity and internal combustion engines. That kind of changed the game plan. That in itself was a revolution. But that led to us needing structure and governance for the things that we do. Off the back of those was kind of the information and the digital revolution, where you have the emergence of computers, the birth of software development, and the transition to digital technologies and the internet. So this led to kind of globalisation and the disruption of traditional industries and the rise of tech giants. The key features, I think, for me is the data and analytics revolution where we are now. It's an explosion of big data and advanced analytics. So before this, we had snapshots, but now because we have that explosion of data analytics and the infrastructure and the capabilities to be able to put those things in place, we can return that snapshot into continuous business analytics.
All right, that's really interesting. It's quite complex then. What about the analytics side?
So the analytics part comes from the capability that we now have for handling big data. So cost to serve in the past was a snapshot in time, but that soon becomes old and therefore not useful over a period of time. But what is useful is that if you can build on that data, so it's not a snapshot, but you're looking at it over a historical period, the discipline of categorizing data, because of the ability to look at big data, the capability that's there now and it's ripe for us to look at the predictive capabilities, dynamic visualizations. There's so many things that we can do if we can look at that data over time and look at that data in sort of deep dives and different slices to work out whether the change we made a positive or negative impact, whether the change we made didn't turn up as some other demand for service somewhere else in the organisation.
For me, the real trigger word there is that change. The idea of organisations being able to look back at a change that they might not have even realised was taking place at the time and then seeing what the impact is, that's quite impactful. Just that alone would be quite useful for organisations and is something they maybe are already collecting data on. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Suddenly we come to this point where instead of producing things that are made up of components, and that's the thing that you need to kind of know the cost of if you're going to know the end cost. From that came the production line. And the production line, if you like, a service that you might deliver that's not a physical product is also a production line because something originates somewhere and there's a value chain that ends up being some value that you've added to the customer. And the idea is that you measure, you put sensors along that value chain and you measure what's happening along that value chain so you can work out what's working and what's not. And quite often also when we look at services, we look at them in silos. And it could be that you've made a change and great, you shave 5 minutes off of a process and that's really costing you, making you saving over here. But what's it doing in the back office?
Yeah.
What's it doing in the point where you're making the delivery? Is there a backlog? Yeah. Is it, and so,
or is it having an effect on the end customer's experience of
correct.
Buying from you? Yes.
These are the things that you need to understand the impact of what you've done. And if you can timestamp a change, then the impact of that change, be it positive or negative, you can have a look at and you can make tweaks and adjustments as you go along. And what I think it does is it empowers the manager of those products and services to make those tweaks rather than it being something that's done from up on high.
I can really see the benefit of this. I can also see that it might be quite intimidating for companies or for someone listening to this thinking, that sounds great, I'd love to have the outputs from that, but that sounds like an awful lot of work. I mean, talk me through what do you think a company would need to take into account before considering cost to serve analytics?
I think they need to take into account their will to want to understand the innards, the underbelly of the services that they are delivering, for understanding what works and what doesn't work. So I'll give you an example. One of the customers I worked with, I was looking at the cost of each service via the different access channels that those services are delivered through. And in one instance, it was £3.50 for a phone call, but £18 for an online transaction.
Wow.
Because the system that used that transaction wasn't integrated. Now, it's not that they didn't know that, they just didn't know how much it was costing. If they knew that, they may have done something different, they may have delayed putting those services online in that way, or they may have absorbed the loss. But knowing those things is really, really important. And quite often, doing something like this can start with just surveys, your customer surveys and your staff surveys. Where do they point to? Where are the problems? Where are the issues?
Okay, so this really is something that could be introduced quite light touch, quite slowly. Somebody listening to this might feel a bit intimidated, thinking, that sounds great, but incredibly complex and a huge investment in time and effort. They can do it incrementally, they can do it step by step.
That's right. So the book takes you through different approaches. So you can do a really deep dive, like a narrow deep dive into one part of a service, or you can have a shallow look at the whole thing and then work out where you want to focus your energies, or you can do it in its entirety. So what I would say is that it doesn't matter about the quality of your data. What matters is that you record the quality of your data so you know what reliance you place on something because the data quality isn't all there.
Okay, that's really interesting. That's not something that I've particularly thought about before. So I think of any projects to do with data as data quality is always an issue, and that you've got good data or bad data. But what you're saying is, as long as you can record the quality of it, then you can still use that data. Yeah, I think that could open up a lot more opportunities for companies who have maybe some historical data that isn't that reliable, but they still have it. Okay.
Even if it comes to tick sheeting, you just give it a data quality ranking. And you know, if you look at those parts of the organisation where the data isn't strong, you know where you need to maybe focus your energies if there are enough transactions going through that part of the system to make it warrant that effort.
Yeah, interesting. I wondered, with what you were talking about, particularly the history of delivering services and manufacturing, what makes this moment in time different? Why is now the time for cost to serve analytics?
The time is now because the technology allows it. If you think about all the different revolutions that we've gone through, at the beginning of this century, we began this data and analytics revolution. It's a big game changer, and it gives us the capabilities to make this a reality, to turn those individual snapshots into something that's realistic, something that is holistic, and something that will give you the measure of where you are. Because you think about how things are right now, you need to go to the supermarket to understand that everything you buy is quite standardized. The same thing is happening with the systems that we purchase. Very slowly, some of the fringe players are being subsumed, and we end up with just a handful of big players, which means we're all kind of formatting the way that we work in a certain way, so we're actually conforming to the middle majority. And without an idea of who you really are as a company and what your strengths are and where you want to go, not understanding the systems and the data that goes through your organisation could prevent you from being great, and could also cause you to fail because you don't see it coming. You don't see that you've been doing these £18 transactions for a very, very long time when your competitors are doing it for £2, which puts up your cost. And you don't know where your costs are coming from. Well, you'll be able to pinpoint exactly where your costs are coming from and exactly what you need to do about it, which could be just to divest, not do that thing, or to do it far better.
So it sounds almost counterintuitive to think where we are now in time, where we are awash with data, every industry, as personal, like non-work related, we've got so much data out there, to say that we don't have enough data, or we're not able to use that in better ways, and yet we have so much.
Yeah, isn't it funny that Google and Amazon and others, and Microsoft, could probably tell you more about your organisation in some respects than you know yourself, but yet still you own data that's chugging around in the innards of your organisation, but you haven't exploited it yet. And you don't know what it should be telling you. You don't know how to stop conforming to that middle majority of doing very standardized things in very standardized ways and hoping for some differentiation to make people choose you and not choose something else, to actually, I understand my power and I can work out where I want to go, which is something that will differentiate what you do, how your customers feel about your services from your competitors.
So it's more than just about the cost to serve. I mean, obviously it's cost to serve analytics, you're analysing it, but this could give a company so much information about why are customers choosing them and their service and their product. There's so much opportunity around this, I would have thought.
There is a lot, and when you think about it, say for the public sector are increasingly challenged to do more with less. There are tens of hospitals and there's hundreds of local authorities. So, and lots of those places already have standards in place that go across the sector. So they do have that capability of understanding exactly where they're wasting money and where they could optimise. That's where I think power could come from. And for the private industry, it says, how can I differentiate from my customers knowing what I am and what I do? Because it gives you that predictive ability to, well, this is where we are. this is what we're going to improve. And from those savings, we've got this money that we could invest into R&D. And because we've got this data, we could predict where the new changes might take us, how customers might respond, and how much profit we might make as a result.
And I suppose as well, the flip side of that is that it might allow organisations, companies to take bigger risks when it comes to making changes or act faster and quicker, because they know that they'll be able to very quickly look and see what that impact is, or what that impact might become. Obviously, you have to be wary of trusting the initial data. And so, yeah, rather than spending a long time making a decision about what changes to make, what changes to invest in, do it quite quickly, and then if it doesn't work, roll it back.
You are so right. It really does allow you to make those tweaks. It also requires us to change the way that we think about projects and change. So when we traditionally in the past, from my experience, you make a change and you embed that change and then you move on. But what we've got to understand is that even if we checked that change and we knew what those benefits were at that time, people change, legislation changes, software development changes, and we make those changes to that perfect process that we got going, and they mess up that process, but nobody knows. In my book, I talk about you understanding the data inputs and having some kind of quality ranking around the data inputs and keeping an audit trail of the assumptions you made about that data, so that later on you can replicate it or you can make a change based on new information that you've got.
So if somebody listening to all of this was still not sure, like, how could this benefit an organisation, how could this benefit us and our customers, what would you say is the overriding benefit of cost to serve analytics?
I would say, think of cost to serve analytics a bit like upgrading, instead of using a compass, using a GPS sat-nav to navigate your business terrain to get you from one place to the other, so that you really do understand, because these are trodden paths, these are things that your technology is telling you, rather than, is that north-northwest, or do you think that's northwest? It's kind of knowing exactly where you're going.
I like that analogy a lot. I think that's, you could still find your way using a compass, but it doesn't give you anywhere near as much sort of instant information as GPS. So there must be some pitfalls that organisations would have to take into account. What should somebody consider before they go down this path?
I think the main consideration is that it should be led from the top, because you need somebody who's going to move away those barriers, that you will need to have some kind of data analytics person capability, and to just remind yourself that actually it's not all plain sailing. You're going to get resistance to change. You might, if you don't think about it properly, come in to get analysis paralysis. And that's why I talk through that book. I talk you through in the book the different ways that you can think about data and think about categorizing data. And the thing that I say first of all is that before you embark on the journey, you should know where you're going. So therefore, it's like imagining this is where we're going, and so therefore you know where you're pointing your sat-nav to.
Let's assume that somebody listening to this isn't going to do everything all at once, isn't going to get that level of investment. Where would they start?
One of the things I speak about in the book is letting data tell stories. For data to tell a story, you need to get the players, the stakeholders in the room around a particular issue or thing. So it's really about how do you collaborate to tell the story of the impact of this one thing that goes wrong, and all the ricochets it has into all the different parts of the organisation. The only way you can tell that story is to get somebody, to get the people in the room with the facilitator to tell the story of this is the impact, this is how it affects us, and this is the cost, and this is the cost over time. And then you can start looking at options for making that better, and what's the cost benefit analysis, what's that payback period of making that change. You can begin to predict, because you know how that thing's behaved, you can predict over time how it will continue to behave and how much it's going to cost you. And it helps you just to make informed decisions about where you want to go forward. It's about that underbelly of understanding your organisation, and then if you know that you need to make a change, planning for that change and the benefits that that change is going to give you.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. That's been a really interesting conversation. Where can people find you if they want to read your book, buy your book, contact you, find out more?
So I'm available on LinkedIn, Jacqui McNish, but also you can buy my book on cost to serve analytics from Amazon.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody listening.